The arrest, which put 3 men in prison and led to one of the great causes célèbres of Australian legal history. Good evening and welcome tonight to a very special program, our last as nationwide. Next year, something altogether new and exciting, but more details of that later. Our puppets will be along too to mark this historic moment on ABC television. And for our grand final night, we reconsider one of Australia's great modern dramas, the Ananda Marga case. Now, those of you who've been following the case will know that a vital witness, Mr. Richard Seary, a police agent, has finally volunteered to return to Australia and give evidence to an inquiry. But what's that inquiry all about? Well, in 1979, Paul Alister, Ross Dunn and Tim Anderson were convicted of the attempted bombing of Robert Cameron, the leader of a small, far right-wing political group. They were also convicted of the attempted murder of police. The question ever since is this: did they get fair trials? The reason for doubt, simply put, is this. The 3 convicted men were members of the Ananda Marga religious sect, and that sect has in the public mind been associated with another crime altogether, the bombing of the Sydney Hilton Hotel during a Commonwealth Leaders Conference. In fact, some people will be surprised to hear that the Ananda Marga 3 are not in jail for the Hilton bombing and that they've never been charged with it. Legally, there's no connection between the Hilton bombing and the charges laid against them. But their case has always been clouded by that earlier event. In this special report, Andrew Saw clarifies a fascinating legal tangle.
At about midnight on June 15, 1978, detectives pulled over a car at Yagoona, a western suburb of Sydney.
Police! Pull over! Right there! Stop there! Okay, come on, get out!
In the car were 2 Ananda Marga members, and the driver was a police agent, Richard Seary.
Spread your legs! Spread up! Okay, check the car!
And also in that car that night, there was a bomb. The police say that Paul Alister and Ross Dunn were on their way to bomb the home of Robert Cameron, the head of a small neo-Nazi group, the National Alliance.
Look out, it's a bomb! Keep out of the way, John. Might be ready to go off. There's a whole heap of jelly in here, too. Yeah, I can see the detonator and the battery. Just get out of the way, I'll pull the wire out.
Later that night, a 3rd Ananda Marga member, Tim Anderson, was arrested at Ananda Marga headquarters. 2 letters claiming responsibility for the planned bombing were allegedly found in his coat pocket. After 2 trials, the 3 men were convicted of conspiracy to murder Mr. Cameron. Alister and Dunn were also convicted of the attempted murder of the arresting detectives. The story behind the arrest and convictions began 5 months earlier, on a Monday morning in February. When council garbage workers emptied a full rubbish bin outside Sydney's Hilton Hotel, there was an immense explosion, and 2 men were blown to pieces. A police constable standing nearby had the back of his head crushed like an eggshell. He died 9 days later. The identity of the Hilton bomber is still unknown, but from the very first day, the Ananda Marga was blamed.
Well, in life one has to get used to many things like this.
The then Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Desai, was staying at the Hilton. He announced the Ananda Marga had tried to kill him. The press was quick to take up the cry, and Ananda Marga press officer Tim Anderson was given the job of defending the sect.
Mr. Anderson, is your organisation claiming any sort of responsibility or involvement in what happened this morning?
No, of course not. It's a terrible thing.
Have you been hit by speculation that perhaps you were involved?
Well, you've come around and another reporter has asked us.
Yeah. Is that somewhat justified, though?
Well, of course, reporters can ask, yeah. But we just hope that investigation will clear this thing up as soon as possible so that the speculation doesn't go on and we're hit by spurious speculation.
Despite Tim Anderson's denial, Mr. Desai had some reason to make his accusation. For several years, the sect in India had been accused of violence as a part of its campaign against the government of Indira Gandhi. Its leader, Pravat Saka, known as Baba, had been jailed on a murder charge which was eventually overturned. In Australia, the sect was accused of political terrorism after a number of incidents involving Indian government officials. In September 77, the Indian military attaché was stabbed during an attempted abduction. Ransom notes were sent threatening the lives and families of Indian government officials in Australia. Now, there was never any proven connection between the Ananda Marga and these incidents, but during late '77, the sect was constantly publicised as a group of violent fanatics. In January '78, the Australian government banned any sect members from entering the country, and a month later, the Hilton bombing. The still unsolved bombing is central to the conviction of Anderson, Dunn and Alistair. To understand why, we have to look at the role of the police agent, Richard Seary.
Richard Seary?
Hey,
Detective Hardy?
Detective Inkster.
Oh, what can we do for you?
I hear you're interested in the Hilton bombing.
Hilton bombing?
3 days after the bombing, Seary went to investigating detectives. He told them that 10 days before the incident, he'd been approached by a member of the Hare Krishna, who asked him how to use explosives. It's worth noting that the Hare Krishna has no connection with the Ananda Marga. They're different sects. Seary said he'd been a member of the Krishnas, and it was known by sect members that he'd had mining experience with explosives. He told the police he'd explained to them how to use an explosive called nitropil.
He said, how does it work? And I said, well, it's generally soaked for 24 hours in dieseline, and that breaks down the neutral base. And it's usually put around a charge of gelignite in a hole. An equal amount of nitropil to the weight of the gelignite increases its potency 4 times.
It's interesting to note that of all the people involved in this case, it was Seary who acknowledged experience with explosives.
Richard Seary, Senior Constable Causey from the Special Branch. Richard.
The police introduced Seary to Senior Constable Jan Crawsey of the New South Wales Special Branch. The Special Branch had had the Ananda Marga under surveillance since 1975, and Seary agreed to infiltrate the sect to seek evidence of involvement with the Hilton bombing. And that's exactly what he claims to have done. 6 days after the arrest for the attempted bombing of Mr. Cameron, Seary went back to the police and said, oh, by the way, on the way out to Yagoona, Dunn and Alistair also confessed to the Hilton bombing. That allegation, never substantiated, was repeated in court. Ross Clark was foreman of the jury at the first trial.
When that evidence came out, it was damning. Whether you believed it or not, you know, the fact that all that evidence was allowed influenced me, I know for sure, and I'd say that it influenced the other people as well.
How did it influence you?
Well, when we were trying to make our decisions, it was mentioned among us. People asked me, well, what do you think about the Hilton? And I said, and I did believe at the time, that it was quite possible that they had done the Hilton bombing. Yet we weren't supposed to be judging them on that, but it was a big factor that you're thinking about maybe letting people off on one charge and worrying about the fact that they may have done a dreadful bombing.
So who is Richard Seary, the man who by now had linked the Ananda Marga with 2 bombings? Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Emmanuel Fisher examined Seary twice and gave evidence at the recent inquiry.
I would sum up Seary's mental state as an individual who is totally unstable. He presents largely because of his early childhood with a personality disorder of some magnitude with schizoid features.
What exactly are schizoid features?
Schizoid means schizophrenic-like. He is not psychotic, but he presents with certain features which one sees in schizophrenia.
Such as?
Such as fantasy, one, that would be the major one.
One person who knows Seary better than most is artist Ken Jerome. He first met Seary in 1971. They worked together and joined the Hare Krishna together in the early 70s. And they were close friends during Seary's time as a spy for the Special Branch.
Well, Dick believed in time, place and circumstance, which was behaviour according to time, place and circumstance. I suppose that'd be summing up Dick.
So he'd change his behaviour depending on the circumstance?
Well, depending on the person, depending on the situation, depending on the environment. That's why he was very good as far as working in to a group. Could be at a party, or it could be just people on the street. He'd sort of assume certain roles.
So this helped him get into the Ananda Marga?
Oh, yeah. And the thing about Dick was that because of this quality that he had, like, he was a very good actor. He was a sort of person who would delve completely into a character or completely into that role. So he would have played the part.
To the extent you think
of spy, undercover, cloak and dagger.
At the recent inquiry, tapes of Siri's conversations with Senior Constable Krawczak were played in public for the first time. The Special Branch opposed the release of the complete tapes at the 2 trials, and the judge at the time ruled they weren't relevant. But they show that during his 4 months as an agent, Siri built up an image of the Ananda Marga as a highly dangerous group of terrorists. He spoke of guerrilla training camps, one outside Taronga Park Zoo. He talked of plans to blow up bridges and trains. And he told Senior Constable Krawczak that the Special Branch were regarded as demons, and the punishment for being a demon was death. And he also asked for a pistol license.
I wouldn't tell you any lies. I wanted to clear up with you a couple of things. One is, if I'm to go to do something very specific with a group of people, armed whatever, and I can see that, or if it comes to the point of me actually having to knock someone off, what's my position then? Say I knock a Margie off, or to stop someone getting hurt?
No, you ring us up.
A few weeks later, Siri told Krawczak that a series of military camps would be set up around Australia.
Well, the first thing I have to tell you is if Bubba's not released now, and I got this personally, you're in for a full-scale terrorist war coming about the middle of June.
Listen, earlier they claimed there was going to be full-scale terrorist activity.
They said full-scale war, I said terrorist activity.
What do they mean by that? What are they going to do?
They're going to fight for Bubba to get him released.
Who are they going to fight?
Everybody.
Throughout the tapes, Siri often contradicts himself. He adds new information as the conversations progress. Here he's talking about arming for the revolution.
They spoke about weapons training. They said a lot of Margies had been buying themselves guns over the last 6 months and they were stored. I don't know where they were stored.
No indication?
No, they didn't give me any idea where they were stored.
Are they stored in one bunch, or people storing their own?
No, they're in one bunch. They're a cache. I believe Narada or one of his assistants is in charge of it.
You don't know how many rifles there are?
I don't know how many or what sort of weapons.
You'll note that Siri said he didn't know what sort of guns were involved. But then, a few minutes later...
Can you remember at this stage what sort of weapons he was talking about?
Yeah. I did hear that one had an M4 rifle. They were discussing the virtues of that one and a 222. One had an automatic 22. They were the three I heard discussed because basically they were discussing different sorts of weapons.
And now, one of the most crucial conversations, the one which points directly to the night of June 15 and that arrest outside the home of Robert Cameron. It's another illustration of the way Siri adds information as conversations progress. Initially, he told Senior Constable Krawczak that the Ananda Marga was planning a demonstration against the National Alliance, the organisation run by Robert Cameron. He said the aim was to make the police intervene, so they'd look as if they were supporting racists. Siri said it was a publicity stunt, and there were no plans for violence. As the conversation progressed, Senior Constable Krawczak asked Siri if there were any plans for a bombing similar to the Hilton. Siri repeated the plans were only for a publicity stunt. But then, a few minutes later...
In relation to the Hilton, there was the demonstration at the airport and the bombing at the Hilton. Now, do you feel that they'd all in the one category go to that extent for the National Alliance?
Well, I think so, yeah. If it does happen, it'll certainly be the modus operandi for the group.
The position you're in at the moment in the organisation, do you feel that Narada or someone like Keppel would confide in you if there was something decent going on like that? Or do you feel it'd be restricted to the people involved?
Oh, I think I'd be approached and asked if I'd volunteer for a job.
You will be?
And if I was asked to volunteer, I wouldn't be told what it was until I had volunteered and said yes.
Do you think you'd be given much time after that?
Depends on how big the job was. He'd have to do preparations, and I'd be in on the preparations.
Okay.
Which would take maybe 3 or 4 days, like in the case of a bomb. I can't see a bomb being made without at least 3 or 4 days' notice.
Remember, at first Siri said there were no plans for violence. And then he says he'll be asked to volunteer for a bombing, and that he'll have several days' notice. However, just 5 days later at police headquarters...
Oh, this is Inspector Perrin, Richard. Tell the inspector what you told me.
Hello, Richard.
There's going to be a bombing in Sydney tonight. The Margies are going to blow up this Cameron guy from the National Alliance.
And where's this going to take place?
We'll have to get a car and meet them at 11 o'clock in Carillion Avenue. Then I go pick up the bomb.
Why would anyone want to blow Cameron up? He's only got a 2-man party. I mean, what harm could he do to them?
Well, according to the Margies, his ideology's bad. People like him shouldn't be allowed to live.
What if the police try to intercept the vehicle before it gets to Gregory Street?
I feel sure Narada will detonate the bomb. They say you have to be willing to die for your cause.
Are you prepared to die?
Oh, I don't want to die, no. I just hope the police know how to handle the situation.
That night, Siri stole a car and parked it in Carillion Avenue outside Sydney University. He was watched by police, some of them only 45 metres away. What happened next is the subject of 2 totally different versions. Central to the case is what Ross Dunn carried to Siri's car that night. All sides agree that Tim Anderson and Paul Alistair crossed Carillion Avenue to meet Siri. The police say Dunn followed them across Carillion Avenue shortly afterwards, and they insist he was carrying a blue denim bag containing the bomb. The same police, witnesses who identified the blue bag, said Dunn was wearing white sand shoes. They said their memory of this was crystal clear.
You can't work done.
The Ananda Marga members say Dunn approached the car from the opposite direction, through the grounds of Sydney University, and they absolutely deny he was carrying anything.
Good day, mate.
And remember those white sand shoes? Well, this is a photograph of the actual arrest, and it tells a different story. And there are other inconsistencies. Senior Constable Krawczyk made detailed notes of the events that night, but he admitted in court later that they made no mention of Dunn carrying a bag. After dropping Anderson off at Ananda Marga headquarters, where he was arrested later, Alistair, Dunn and Siri drove to Yagoona. They were followed by unmarked police cars. Alistair and Dunn have always claimed they were driving to Yagoona to paint graffiti outside Cameron's home. But it must be pointed out that no painting materials or posters were found in the car that night. Alistair and Dunn say Siri pointed out the bag containing the bomb during the trip. They asked Siri to turn back, but he refused.
What is this, Richard?
It's gelagnite, mate.
What for?
To blow up a bomb, mate.
Shortly afterwards, they were arrested. But there is conflicting evidence about the detail of that as well. One detective said he saw Dunn sitting in the back seat with his hands inside the blue bag. He said he grabbed Dunn by the throat and dragged him from the car. Now, the police believe that Dunn was about to detonate the bomb, and that evidence was central to the conviction of Dunn and Alistair for the attempted murder of police. But another detective said he saw the bag sitting upright on the back seat after Dunn, Alistair and Siri had been dragged from the car. The defence argues that if Dunn had his hands in the bag and was dragged roughly from the vehicle, was the bag likely to have been left sitting upright on the back seat? And there is another conflict of evidence, the unsigned confessions or verbals attributed to the 3 men. Tim Anderson is alleged to have said,
Nazi racists do not belong here. You prevented us from doing this, but others will follow.
One of the police is alleged to have said to Ross Dunn,
Do you realise you could have killed a lot of innocent people if that bomb had gone off as planned?
And Dunn is alleged to have replied,
That could not be helped. We are committed.
You people deserve to die for stopping us.
The Ananda Marga say they have a policy of not talking to the police without a lawyer being present, and that claim is supported by police records. The police raided Ananda Marga headquarters shortly after the Hilton bombing, and their records show that Tim Anderson, acting on advice from a barrister, instructed others they weren't required to supply their particulars, and yet a few months later they give a verbal confession. At the first trial, the jury failed to reach a verdict. But at the second trial, 6 months later, as demonstrators protested outside, it was a different story. Once again, there was emphasis on serious allegations that the three men had admitted to bombing the Hilton, even though this had nothing to do with the charge they were facing. After a long trial, the jury was unanimous. Alistair, Dunn and Anderson were found guilty and were sentenced to 16 years jail with no parole. But the campaign to have a judicial inquiry into the convictions has continued ever since, and one of the most vociferous supporters has been Senator Gareth Evans.
Look at the evidence in the case. It falls into three broad categories. There's the oral testimony of this extraordinary character, Siri. There's the alleged verbal, unsigned confessions brought forward by the police, and you've got the eyewitness testimony of the police. Looked at in isolation, each of those categories of evidence, I think, is riddled with implausibilities, uncertainties, improbabilities, and I doubt very much if any jury had its mind not been coloured by the general hysterics and histrionics and atmospherics that had been generated by the circumstances of the Hilton bombing and the treatment of the Ananda Marga generally in the press. I doubt that any jury, any fair-minded jury, could have come on the basis of that evidence to a belief that they were guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Earlier this year, following the release of ASIO material concerning the Hilton bombing and the tapes you saw reenacted earlier, the New South Wales Attorney-General, the late Paul Lander, ordered an inquiry. A number of psychologists and psychiatrists who had worked with Richard Siri when he was overcoming a drug addiction gave evidence about his reliability. I asked Dr. Emmanuel Fisher if a person displaying Siri's schizoid traits would be a reliable witness.
Most decidedly not.
So he would make up things to get himself attention?
That's right. You're quite right. That's the word I was looking for before. Attention-seeking. Very important to him.
So it was
he was deprived of it in early childhood. Now, he is seeking attention, and he would go to any lengths to achieve it.
Now, during his time in the Ananda Marga, he made a lot of quite bizarre allegations about the sect. He talked of bombings and of terrorist wars and plans to blow up bridges and trains. Is this sort of highly lurid accusation consistent with that sort of schizoid personality?
Yes, very much so.
Some of the new evidence first heard at the inquiry concerns the letters allegedly found in Tim Anderson's pocket on the night of the arrests. You remember that he was arrested at Ananda Marga headquarters some hours after the others were arrested at Yagoona. The two letters addressed to morning newspapers claimed responsibility for the planned bombing of Mr. Cameron's house. The Crown always maintained they were typed on the Ananda Marga typewriter, but according to typewriter analyst Michael Connell, that simply isn't the case.
I noticed that the source document, which is the original document typed and found on one of the people arrested, had peculiar characteristics which were not evident when I tried to duplicate the document on the typewriter, which was apprehended at the time of arrest.
The Ananda Marga typewriter?
The Ananda Marga typewriter.
So what were those differences?
This document I've got here is the source document. This is the note found on Anderson the night he was arrested. This is the document I typed in duplication of that document. When I typed it, I noticed there was a remarkable lack of alignment on the left-hand side of each line.
So when you put them on top of each other, they're different, is that the case?
Yes, because they are typed under transparency, it is possible to overlay the documents, and when you overlay them, it is quite evident and obvious to anyone who looks at them, there is a discrepancy.
And the police claim that both documents were typed on the same typewriter?
Yes, they do.
More new evidence concerning Siri's credibility was given at the inquiry by his longtime friend, Ken Jerome. They were in the Hare Krishna sect together, And years before the Hilton bombing, he claimed Siri planned to bomb the Homebush abattoir in Sydney.
Well, I was there at the time when a conversation did go between he and another member of the Krishna temple.
And what did he say?
Was that they were planning to bomb the meatworks because of the scriptural injunction about meat eating, and that this society is sinful because of meat eating.
Did he go into?
And that was the reason. That was the reason given. It was because of that they were going to go out and bomb the meatworks.
Did they give details of how he planned to do it?
Well, there were details. I mean, they had a drawing set up, and the place had been cased for possible places where the bomb could be put.
At the inquiry, lawyers for the Ananda Marga members placed considerable emphasis on Jerome's testimony that once before Siri had planned to involve members of a religious sect in a bombing. But according to Mr. Finane QC, appearing for the Crown, none of the new evidence presented at that inquiry had significant bearing on the convictions of Alistair, Dunn and Anderson. He said the men had been tried by due process of law and had subsequently failed in appeals to higher courts. He said that should be the end of the matter. Mr. Finane said that most of the new evidence presented to the inquiry would have been inadmissible in court, but even if it had been, he said, it wouldn't have affected the outcome. Ultimately, the fate of the three men will be up to the New South Wales government. Mr. Justice Wood will complete his report to the government as soon as possible, but he can only make a recommendation. The final decision about the fate of Ross Dunn, Tim Anderson and Paul Alistair will have to be made by the politicians.
And Andrew Saw compiled that report. Throughout the current 6-month inquiry, Richard Siri refused to return from England, where he's been living, to give evidence. But this week, after the inquiry had concluded, he contacted the counsel assisting and said he wished to come back to Sydney to appear before the hearing. He'll appear in court on Monday, and his appearance could mean that the reconvened inquiry will run for months.